Like, okay, perfect.
Oh, we have.
Okay. So people are still signing in, but while they're signing in, I'm going to do a couple of intros and housekeeping notes. So thank you everyone for joining us today. We're going to be doing a webinar today on emotional well-being during COVID-19. Thanks to the awesome team at Doctors Without Borders. We do have Dr. Cindy Scott and Ms. Athena Viscusi. Am I pronouncing that right? I'm so sorry if I butchered it.
You did great.
Joining us, and they're going to be doing this awesome session. I want to thank our sponsor today, Modern Woodman Fraternal Financial, sponsored the program today. So we want to thank them for bringing us this program. I also want to take a moment to thank our VIP partners for 2020. We are so appreciative to them for their contributions. A couple of quick housekeeping notes for the webinar. If you look in the Zoom platform, there is a Q&A button that you can click on, and you can type in questions throughout the program. There is also a chat button, so you can put comments or questions in there as well. And once Dr. Cindy and Ms. Athena are done speaking, we'll do a Q&A session and get your burning questions answered. So without further ado, I'm going to turn it over to them to take over and share their awesome information.
Thank you.
Right. Here we go. All right, Athena.
Welcome. Maybe go ahead and introduce yourself, Cindy, because you're the one on the ground.
Hi, I'm Dr. Cindy, and I'm the person in Detroit right now.
And I'm calling in from my home in Brooklyn, New York, where MSF has a headquarters office in New York City, but we're working from home right now. I just wanted to tell you briefly about Doctors Without Borders. We call ourselves MSF by our French initials, and what we do and why we're with you here today. So we provide emergency medical care all over the world. We're right now operational about 70 different countries, and we intervene in situations of violent conflict, natural disasters, and epidemics a lot. And we particularly focus on marginalized populations, people who don't usually have access to health care. And we do include mental health care in our interventions, and particularly in epidemics, we found that it's necessary to provide mental health services to our patients and to their families, and particularly in epidemics as well to our staff and the families of our staff. And so we have also created what we call psychosocial care units in all of our different headquarters offices, which is what I do. I run the psychosocial care unit in New York, and my function is to provide support to our staff on the ground in all the different countries where we serve. But I have also worked, just like Dr. Scott, in epidemics, particularly cholera and Ebola in other countries.
Great. So,
and in the intervention in Detroit is specific. You might explain that.
Okay. So I'm so pleased to be with you here today for this short time. As a psychologist with MSF, Athena mentioned that we work in disasters, conflicts, displacement, in addition to outbreaks, been in drug-resistant tuberculosis, diphtheria, and Ebola. And it's just so amazing. We never imagined that we would be here today doing an assignment in the US. It's very strange that our resume is relevant. But during such a systemic disruption all over the world, we are really honored to stand in solidarity with healthcare providers in the US as we face COVID-19. So as what people may not realize when we respond to emergencies is that we often hire hundreds of local staff to work with us. So as a manager, just like you, I'm often in that really precarious position of trying to manage my own stress, minimize the trauma and stress on my staff, while at the same time I'm asking them to work very hard in difficult circumstances. So today I want to share a couple points on stress and well-being. And what I'm sharing may not be new or novel, but because of the chronic uncertainty and overwhelming need, it really pays for all of us to slow down, take a moment to reflect and to support each other in this regard. So we'll talk a little bit about the impact, we'll talk about common reactions, and then we'll talk about how we can reduce the negative impact on ourselves and our teams.
I don't want to overlook that we all have an additional stressor, I think, following this weekend is the focus on violence in our communities, and particularly police violence towards people of color. Yeah. That this is highlighting a double burden, that the communities there that are disproportionately affected by the epidemic are disproportionately affected by this community violence. And so that's an additional stressor that all of us are under in our communities, in our homes and at work. I don't want to ignore that.
Yes, yes. Thank you, Athena. So I understand that I'm speaking to a group of administrators and department heads who have quite a lot of experience, and I'm sure that you've had a lot of experience with stressful situations. So I'm actually a bit curious to know what has surprised you the most during this crisis. If anybody can speak up or add it to the chat box, I'd be interested to know.
Please feel free to type in the chat box, or I think you can also click to raise your hand and I can allow you to speak. Okay, we have one person who would like to speak.
Okay, go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We can.
I think what's most surprising for me during the crisis is the people's reaction, like the public's reaction. I'm here in Michigan, and we had several protests down at the governor's home and at the Capitol building because people were upset, because the governor thought, she's doing what she thinks is best to protect us and keep us safe. And people are just so upset and angry about it. And I was surprised about that.
Yes, yes. It's a very good point.
Have you found any anger or targeting of healthcare workers? Because in some communities, they've reported that people are afraid of people who work in nursing homes or in hospitals because they may be carrying the disease. I don't know if any of you have encountered that.
A couple of comments in the chat here. One says, I've never heard such desperation and despair from healthcare team members. Utter sadness at the losses and the lack of them seeing a way back to the light. They will never be the same, but they will need to plan how to move on more whole than they are currently. Another comment was the resilience of the social workers, nursing staff, and administration in meeting the needs of the patients. Ongoing encouragement and connection with families and patients. I also see another hand raised here, so I'm going to unmute.
Thank you.
Oh, I'm sorry. I was just responding to Athena's question. Yep. So I have like a couple people that I've worked with in the past, like nurses who works in the ER over in Jackson, Michigan, and it's hitting them pretty hard. A lot of nursing friends that I know or have, it's hitting them pretty hard. I even had one nurse friend who he's actually living in his garage, because he's taking care of people with COVID, and he has a little son and a wife at home, and he doesn't want to take home. So yeah, I'm seeing them impact a lot.
Yes. And we're hearing this from all over the world, actually. People working in long-term care facilities are feeling overworked. There's a decrease of staff. We heard from one home that said that sometimes they were surprised that nursing home staff were not even considered frontline workers and therefore not prioritized for PPE or for training. Another person said that multiple sets of guidelines to follow, but there was no practical help on how to implement them, and that the guidelines were even confusing and conflicting. So there have been a lot of surprising things. Is there anyone else that wants to say what surprised them the most?
I see two more comments here. What I find surprising is a complete opposite of all the wonderful ways I've seen people step up and strive to help, coupled with people being very difficult, refusing to work, or faking symptoms in order to be off work.
Good point.
And then another one says, what also surprised us is the lack of a sufficient national stockpile of PPE and the federal government arriving to assist nursing homes many times after the wave had already hit.
Yes, and so this is really all the very shocking things that are weighing on nursing home staff and healthcare workers in general. Thank you for that. It's very sobering times. So many of us are facing a lot of the common stressors related to COVID-19, and you can probably add to this even more. Just the concerns about the health you were talking about with the man in his garage. Then we have the economic downturns and the healthcare disparities that have just blown up in our face, as well as worry about how it's going to impact families and children. But with our work, we're actually exposed to some additional pressures. As you mentioned, there's a staff shortage sometimes, and our roles and our job duties may change. I'm hearing of managers feeling both the pressures of doing their managerial work and then having to fill in shifts and doing double duty, the changes in working conditions, concerns about exposure, or if workers that do get sick, will they return? With witnessing multiple deaths, and many of the things that make our jobs interesting and helpful to our patients, like have been canceled, like community dining, visits, and activities, and of course limited PPE, staffing concerns, and also we're facing some ethical and moral dilemmas that we maybe wouldn't have to normally face. I know we experienced that with Ebola, where we were only allowed to wear the full PPE for 45 minutes because we were in very hot climate. And if you actually were in there longer than 45 minutes, you risk fainting or becoming completely dehydrated and then infecting yourself. So at 45 minutes, they'd say, leave the facility. And many of our staff felt this was quite a moral dilemma, because there were still patients that needed their care in front of them, and yet they had to leave at that moment. So you may be facing some similar dilemmas in your work also. And maybe some of the workers are even being stigmatized for working in long-term nursing care. So these are just some, and I'm sure you can add more to this list. So I just want to remind us all that the impact of this stress, it impacts every domain of our life, the cognitive, our thinking, emotional, social. It's really impacted our social abilities, physiological, and even spiritual. When I'm faced with these stressful times, often I'm thinking, well, I only feel the negative parts. But sometimes when I look back on it, as many of you mentioned, we also see some positive aspects to this stress. You know, some of us find extra determination. We feel involved, we feel challenged, we feel connected in new ways, and we're finding ways to behaviors to surprise and enjoy and bless people. We may be more alert and ready. And spiritually, we may be finding renewed meaning and purpose in our activities. So there's both these negative and positive attitudes. So with acute stress reactions, you know, as medical people that our bodies are really wired to manage this acute stress. And it's wired that way to actually protect us from danger. And the way it protects us is it bypasses our thinking ability, and it helps us to either fight or get out of danger. But some of the normal reactions that happen in acute stress reactions, you may recognize them. One is intrusive reactions where you might be re-experiencing things even on your time off, when bad dreams or your body might be reacting to reminders of what's happened. It could be a smell, it could be a sensation, a sound that can just bring you back to that moment. I even had this happen to me when I took the plane over here. I wore an N95 mask to protect me from the airplane being in a closed environment. And the smell of the N95 mask, I was thinking, wow, this smell is making me feel very weird. I just couldn't, finally I said, what does this mean? And then I suddenly remembered the last time I wore this mask is when I spent many hours in a palliative care ward for drug-resistant tuberculosis with people dying. And then also I could remember some of the good things we did to bring hope and to their legacy and meaning in this experience. But those moments of remembering can also feel kind of intrusive unless you stop and think about them and relate them to what's going on. The second one is stress reaction is avoidance or withdrawal. We might see this in COVID with people who just say, I don't believe it's happening. I'm not gonna wear a mask. And maybe somehow acknowledging the magnitude of this crisis is just too much. So it's better just to deny it's all happening. Another stress reaction is changes in our mood and thinking. Maybe we're having more negative thoughts all day. Maybe we're having, our beliefs are changing to be more negative, difficulty expressing emotions. And then this last one is hyperarousal. And this is an important one because this is a reaction that might be displayed in our staff's behavior and our behavior. This is when we're feeling jumpy and nervous and maybe quite irritable and quick to anger in the moment. These are actually reactions to the stress that's going on. And all of these reactions are normal, but if you can't identify them and you don't relate them to the stress you're going through, it can actually be more overwhelming. And you know, it seems like the world is imposing all of this on us, and then when your body starts reacting, it seems like it's also, you're out of control of your body. So it's happening from the outside and happening from the inside. But once you identify and know these, you can help staff to know what to do with it by we do training in psychological first aid and identifying ways to cope with these reactions. Now, the thing is that even though this is a protective measure for us, it cannot be maintained over the long run. You can't stay in that high alert mode. Even what was meant to protect us can actually become damaging to us. And so sustained stress, new stress piled on, can exhaust or overwhelm our current stress response. So let's
And these reactions you were saying, Cindy, can be really impact the work environment, right? The
Yes.
cumulative stress of my stress on top of your stress on top of her stress on top of his stress, and then also these are reactions that then we bring home, and then or don't act our best in our families. So those are a couple of reasons why we really want to address them. Without addressing them, we will naturally become depleted. Like you were saying, it's just overwhelming.
Yeah.
So we do need to find ways to address them.
Well, and initially we thought this was going to be a sprint, didn't we? We thought we were going to close down for a couple weeks and get this thing handled. And now, unfortunately, it's become a marathon, and there's no real end in sight for a while. So let's take a look at a few things that might be helpful to minimize some of the impact of what we're facing. Of course, self-care is what we're hearing a lot about. And the reason I address this first is because often, not only is it important for our own stress, but it's also a good model for our staff. And the more we know about our own feelings, our limitations, our coping skills, the better we can help our staff. And it goes the other way too. The more our staff take care of themselves, the better they can serve our patients. And everyone is different. There's really no one size fits all. You'll see lists of ways to manage your mental health. But what I would say is, if you had strategies that have worked for you in the past, keep doing those strategies. And Athena, you had mentioned too that maybe those strategies are no longer available. Do you want to say something?
If our strategy is going out with the girls after work, or if our strategy is going to the park with the kids, or going to the gym, and none of these things are available, we have to replace them with something, because actually we're giving more than usual. So we need to be replenishing more than usual. These are the things that replenish us. And if they've been cut off, we have to find ways we have to be creative about how we're going to replace them.
Right, yeah. So in addition to the duration of this crisis, because of the duration, will likely have to be much more intentional about these self-care strategies. I was listening to a neuropsychologist who was talking about all the stress hormones that are flooding our brains at this time. And he said there's actually studies to show that we can lose insight as to how stressed we really are. Somehow we become accustomed to the stress and we forget that we're not operating in full capacity. So that's why it's really important to build these routines into our daily lives, because we can't wait to suddenly say, oh, I feel stressed now. You may not even be realizing how stressed you are. So these things these routines are going to be protective factors and buffers when our insight has become more limited. So some helpful strategies for self-care is, of course, we need to take time to pause and remember that this is not business as usual. This is unprecedented times. And as Athena was saying, we really have to spend more time than usual on self-care routines. We might need more sleep than usual, more physical activity, more time in our meditation or yoga. So it's not a time to wait till we feel stressed. And I think it's really important that we honor our work. You're doing something quite extraordinary right now. You're caring for the most vulnerable people, and to honor that and remind yourself that in spite of the obstacles and frustrations, you're fulfilling this calling. and to be gentle too.
One of the comments had been how impressed, the first comment was how impressed the person was. I think it was one of my social work sisters. I forgot to say I'm a social worker. How impressed they were with the resilience among their colleagues. But when do we say that? When do we take a time to say, like, aren't we amazing? We're so resilient. We're so creative. We've adapted so well, like never, right? We're like, we're overwhelmed. We can't take it, you know? So yeah, it's carving out that place to honor how amazing we are. We're glad we gave you an opportunity today to say that you admire the resilience of your colleagues.
And,
but keep saying it. Keep saying
yes,
it.
we have to. And you know, we have to. It really helps to develop some adaptive ways of thinking too. And I was thinking to myself, can we really find meaning or purpose in this terrible situation? Maybe we can, or maybe we can't. But I just have to remember that this is an extraordinary time. You know, the gaps that we're identifying in our healthcare system, and the gaps we're identifying in how we help our aging folks, and the solutions we are crafting together, these are really going to shape the healthcare system in the future. And, you know, somehow we get to be a part of that. And somehow, living through this time, we're going to have stories to share with our grandchildren. So maybe there is a sense of purpose and meaning. And Athena, did you have any other thoughts on adaptive thinking?
No, I think it came out in that point of celebrating the good, you know, as well as focusing on the bad and the things. I really like what's written here about also realizing what we have control over and what we can't. We can get really into the way it should be and the way it could have been if they had reacted sooner, if they had done this, if they had done that, the way it should be, if only, you know, they would do this, if they would do that, if only this would happen. And those may be entirely true, 100% true, but focusing on them is not helpful, you know, does not help us be, okay, but what is right now, and what adaptation do I have to make to what is right now? Yes, it should be like this. Yes, it could have been like that, but it is this way. And then you were saying, you know, that flexible, the more stressed we are, the less we have flexible thinking. Really de-stressing so that we can face what's in front of us and come up with solutions.
Yes. Well, that's the radical acceptance. It's saying, wow, this is the way it is, instead of fighting it, focusing on what we can do next, what we do have control over. I've had some people say it helped them to even make a list of what I have control over, what I don't have control over, and letting those things go. And lastly here, this, you know, we've heard it so much, but we have to say it. It's so important every day to disconnect from work and do something else that has nothing to do with work. And this, you may even do this during lunch hours or breaks, but definitely when you go home in the evening, that you have to find some other way to disconnect and relax, find something enriching for your soul. So
I would say, along with radical acceptance, maybe it's a good time for radical forgiveness also. You know, being forgiving of each other as colleagues, forgiving of our patients, forgiving of their families, you know, that everybody's in a heightened state of stress. And we would like to be forgiven for our not stellar moments, right? So it may be a good time to forgive each other for our not so stellar moments. Yes. We're all doing the best we can with what we got.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Athena. And, you know, when we after self-care, we also start thinking about our teams. And, you know, it's particularly difficult for those who are coping with the death of colleagues or residents. And, you know, many of these, we've lost people who've become like family to us. And it's compounded by the loss of so many other things in our life. and during COVID, it may be particularly difficult because we're seeing people die without their families. And it's come on so suddenly and taken so many. And you know, the religious or cultural things that were in place where friends and loved ones can gather together for comfort, those have also been taken away. So just a few words on this, you know, grief cannot be avoided. I like the quote that says, if you hope to avoid grief, then you'd have to avoid love. You know, grief is something of value and it's worth protecting, and grief is necessary. This is how we process these and integrate these losses into our lives. And you know, grieving has no particular time. We may grieve some of this, but we may have to go through a whole other round of grieving once this life gets back to so-called normal. These are layers, and it's going to take a very long time. So what I have found in the field is that it really helps to ask the team what they would like to do to honor, to remember, and to grieve during this time. I've had teams come up with really creative ways, and sometimes they've come up with ways that they do now, and then they come up with new ways as the situation changes. I'm thinking of an example when I was in the Ebola Management Center. I had told the staff that one of my coping mechanisms was to walk around the perimeter of the facility and stop at various places to remember what happened there, to grieve if I needed to, and just honor what has happened. And the staff all lit up and they said, "Oh, Dr. Cindy, can we do that with you?" And I was a bit surprised, but then we planned for it, and we spent the most beautiful couple hours where together we walked through the facility, and each of them, we gave permission for them to share stories, to cry, to laugh, to say words, and they shared stories. So in this place, we saw our colleague die. In this place, we had that very difficult arguing woman who then ended up actually saving a baby. And it was one of the more touching experiences I had out in the field. But your team will also find ways to grieve that might be new because we don't have our standard way to do this. Do you want to add anything on this, Athena?
No, I think we can move on because we wanted to talk about, you know, grieving the losses, but also celebrating the victories.
Yes, that's right. And you know, maybe some of our focus on staff well-being has worked in the past, but we have found during crises, ongoing crises like that, we really have to amplify our focus. And so in celebrating our achievements, the team on the right is my team from the Ebola health promoters and psychosocial counselors. So after we walked through the compound, they wanted to celebrate. And we sat and through each individually identified their strengths and what they personally achieved. And we just had the most wonderful day. And you had a picture here too, didn't you, Athena?
Well, yeah, because in the Ebola treatment center where I worked, every time a patient survived, before they went home, we asked them to make a handprint on the wall. And so that wall was present to us during our work every day. So even though we were losing patients every day, we had this proof, you know, because the brain is wired to the negative and to the crisis in front of it, but we had this visual reminder of how many had survived and that it was thanks to our work that they had survived. And then that, you know, there was a new print every day or a few new prints every day, and it grew and grew, and we could celebrate, you know, as well as honoring the losses, celebrating the achievements. And, you know, just like the colleague was, you know, saying, celebrating the resilience of her colleagues, like, you know, when do we take time to do this, to celebrate all the good that we're doing, even in the midst, you know, we're afraid of belittling the losses or belittling how hard it is, but actually it helps us endure the losses and endure how hard it is, the more we are able to also be in touch with the positive.
And also with staff well-being, we might, more than usual, have to create a safe place for people to speak up, ask questions, voice concerns, and we might have to be providing more information to resources and ways they can access additional help.
I had mentioned that one of the things we did was also provide support to the families of staff, because just like the family that has the gentleman living in the basement, you know, imagine you come off a 12-hour shift, all you want to do is go home and hug your loved ones, and instead you go straight into the shower and isolate yourself in the garage, right? It's also that the families had a lot of questions about, you know, how is it transmitted? What is the risk of being around my loved one who works in the facility? And just providing them that information was very reassuring and made them feel much more in control of the situation, and then able to support their loved one who was on the care team much better.
Mm-hmm.
But they're kind of left out there by themselves, you know, with all, and then in the media, all this misinformation and stuff. So they also needed to have good information.
Yes. And sometimes in our teams, we have people that need special support. And these are usually employees who've had struggles even before COVID-19. Often they're people that might be have previous problems with substance abuse, have a very difficult home environment or domestic violence. Maybe they've suffered from a mental condition previously, or maybe it's just someone who's had multiple losses and now this one's come. These are employees that need to be identified because they are at higher risk for problematic stress responses. And these are the ones that we might need to check in more frequently, find out about their basic needs even, and help lead to resources and be a listening ear more than usual. And because of the prolonged nature of this crisis, we might have to implement these strategies that will help us for the long term. And just some small examples of things we've done are, for example, like a daily flash meetings or huddles. This is where we can disseminate good information, make our staff feels like we're on top of it. We're going to give them what they need for the job this day. So many are telling me that at the end of a long shift, they're facing this inbox of long list of emails that they just can't go through. So these information sessions are just help people feel comfortable and confident through the day. And then we usually also had an end of the day wrap up where they can bring up concerns or questions that came up. And this is actually the place where we do celebrating. What went well? What can we celebrate? What can we end with on a celebration so that we can go home? And I want my staff to go home and enjoy their family, go home and not have these things come back in their dreams. Now, I found that when we first started this procedure, they took a little long, but after we did it routinely, we could usually do it in about 5 minutes at the end of the day. We've also found it really helpful to have a peer-to-peer support system. And we've done this a number of ways, establishing a buddy system where staff members are paired up and they agree to check in with each other throughout the day. And many of our buddy system people have become lifelong friends. It's so wonderful to see. Or sometimes we select a focal point person who can check in with people as they're wrapping up their shift.
And on top of the work that I do in the psychosocial care unit in Doctors Without Borders, we also have a peer support network where people who have, some of our workers volunteer to be support to their colleagues. When they're coming back from their assignments abroad, they check in with them. So they're not professional mental health people, but they're people who've also lived through it and who've been given a little bit of extra training in compassionate listening and reflective listening. And people find that so helpful, because to hear from somebody who cares, but somebody who's also lived through it, who can really understand, because it's, like it's so hard for me to imagine what it must be like to be working in a nursing home all day, you know, just like it might be hard for you to understand some of the work that we've done, what it's like all day. So I found, and that's like a super good support that anybody can provide. You don't need to be a professional. And I had mentioned, I heard in a hospital in New York, something they were doing, they were, the staff who had to be at home quarantined either because they had a sick relative or they had been tested positive themselves or they had had a high risk exposure, they were making check-in calls to the staff that were still working. And it benefited both of them because the ones who were at home were so guilty that they were not on the ward helping their colleagues. But then the colleagues were so happy to talk to somebody who had a bigger bandwidth, you know, than somebody who'd also been working a 12-hour shift in the midst of it all. I thought that was a really interesting intervention to put in place.
Very nice point. I know we're kind of running towards the end of our time, so I'm going to move ahead a little quickly here. Of course, we're concerned about our patients or residents that are in isolation, and one of the things we do is we provide trainings like psychological first aid to assist staff to manage this difficult situation for our residents. And I just want to highlight a few takeaway points from this short time. It's way too short, and I really wanted to hear more from you. This, number one, this is really a prolonged time of stress. So knowing the acute signs of stress will help us in understanding, clarifying, and addressing staff concerns in a more helpful way. We found that amplifying and developing a routine of staff care strategies can really be a buffer against long-term negative consequences. And a consistent flow of good information related to IPC and the developing science can really help staff to feel safe and protected. And, you know, while there are normal reactions if someone is observed to have prolonged changes in their behaviors for more than a few weeks and it's impacting their functioning, of course, they need to be referred to an EAP or mental health provider. And the fifth thing is that even though this virtual connecting and telehealth has been vital in this crisis, as an organization, we see one of our strengths is that we like to be present in those situations. We want to be there to demonstrate safety on site. We want to provide mental health or well-being support on site to people. So thank you for this. And I think I'm going to switch over to some of our Q&As if we still have some time left.
We do. So just a reminder to attendees, you can type your question in the chat box. You can also type it in the Q&A box. Either one will work. I'll monitor both. Or you can click the raise your hand and we will allow you to ask your question live. Now I did see one question typed in already. Some staff won't launch self-care strategies. They use this pandemic stress as a sort of security blanket, and that's not healthy. How do we help them move through in a healthy way? How can we support each other?
It's a good question. Athena, do you want to?
Well, I think that's one thing we found in Doctors Without Borders, that if we asked people, like, are you stressed? Would you like to see a psychologist? The answer is no, right? Like, I'm fine. I'm a hero healthcare worker. Don't you know? They cheer for me every night at 7. But if we provide it on site, if we make that space on site, then people take advantage of it. And it doesn't need to be having a mental health professional on site, but some of these peer support strategies, having the check-ins like Dr. Cindy was saying at the beginning of the day or at the end of the day, having a webinar that's provided at lunchtime or, whenever it's possible with somebody explaining some strategies. Telling people who are stressed what they should do to take care of themselves, often, it goes in one ear and out the other. If you tell me what I should do right now, I'm not listening to you. But if you tell me what you do to take care of yourself, I may listen to that. That may be a lot more helpful. So sharing with staff strategies that work for ourselves as people as human beings, can be more helpful than telling them what they should do.
Exactly.
Go ahead.
And I think your point too is that a lot of people hesitate to call these helplines and talk to a stranger, or even, most people are reluctant to reach out to our EAPs or mental health providers. So offering something on site first is actually a good strategy.
Excellent. I see one hand raised, so I'm going to turn it over to the audience member to speak here. You are live.
I'm not hearing.
Hold on.
Just while we're figuring that out, somebody had made a comment about injustice of some people getting hazard pay and some people getting laid off. And, I don't want to diminish that. But again, that goes into the what should be and what we have control over and what we don't. So do we have control over complaining to the right people? Do we have, control over going to a union, taking some concrete positive actions, or are we just making ourselves bitter by thinking about how bad it is, right? So the injustices definitely exist, but can we find productive ways to make change? Like Dr. Cindy was saying, this pandemic highlights so many of the inequities and so many of the injustices, and it's challenging us to find new ways to counter those, right? So if it's just dwelling on how bad it is, this is going to be harmful to ourselves. If it's stimulating us to find a way to solve it and getting together and banding together for new solutions, then that can actually be a stress buster in a weird way, right? I don't want to ignore that sense. That sense of injustice is heavy, heavy, heavy. I hope the person can ask their question now.
Yeah.
So I've allowed talking. This is directed at the person who's logged in as social work. I'm allowing talking, but it's not allowing me to unmute you. So I think you have to do it on your end. Please try unmuting yourself and see if that works. Otherwise, I'll have you type in your question. Doesn't seem to be working. So I'm going to ask whoever's logged in as social work, please type in your question. I do see another question in here that says, please give an example of psychological first aid.
Well, for me, this is a training that we offer to our staff to help reduce the immediate stress of what's going on. And we practice it with our staff. I had a staff member who had a particularly traumatic experience working with a patient in the emergency room. And so she came to me because I wanted everybody to feel free to share their worries and concerns. So she actually came to me and she started explaining to me what she did. She did everything, and then she just started sobbing. And I listened and reflected with her. And then suddenly she said, this problem, I have a son that was the same age as this patient. And so then I noticed that she was somebody who felt it even more deeply than other staff because she could relate to it. So this listening and calming, there's a set of specific skills that we train staff in. And then after a few minutes, she says, well, I'm ready to go back to work. And it was like, wow, she really could manage this, and we could implement those skills of psychological first aid.
And the psychological first aid is, not psychotherapy, which is, digging into people's deep issues, but the idea is restoring them to their previous functioning before the tragedy, before the disaster. So it's just stabilizing people and giving them the ability to recover their natural strength, as opposed to, therapy.
Right. This can be done by non-professionals, actually. We even train security guards and cleaners and cooks, because sometimes people feel most comfortable unloading on the head cook in the facility. And this person loves to have these skills.
Excellent. I don't see any other questions from the audience right now, but I wanted to ask Cindy and Athena, I know you guys have been doing these webinars often. What kind of common questions have you been receiving? Are there any that stick out that our audience might be interested in?
Yeah, I mean, I know a lot of people have concerns about supporting their children through this. You know, I think that's a whole other theme, but I don't want to ignore that, you know, that people have had a lot of concerns about that. And also people who are managing, you know, sick people or at-risk people at home and then going into work to do the same, that's this double burden. Those are the two things that come to mind. I don't know about you, Cindy.
Yeah, well, I get a lot of questions about psychological first aid, and this is just a wonderful skill that, of course, it takes a brief training to get people on board with it, and we have fun with it, but it can be so helpful and reassuring to have those skills.
So Athena, back to what you mentioned, what do you recommend for employers that are dealing with employees who have those, you know, sick or at-risk family members, or they have small children? You know, what are your recommendations there?
I think what Cindy was saying, you know, listening to people, and what somebody at the very beginning had commented about how annoying it is to have colleagues who are faking, you know, to have symptoms so that they don't have to come into work. But are we giving them other options than faking symptoms in order to take a day off from work? Like, is there an option to say, you know, my kid is like, you know, swimming in homework, he's losing it, I just really need to spend a day with him, getting him back on track. You know, is that available even in this high crisis situation where we need all hands on deck? We don't want people feeling like the only option is to fake, you know, in order to get a break. So I think that's one, is just listening. And then the more we listen, you know, maybe everybody's struggling with the same thing in the team, but there just hasn't been a space to talk about it. So if we can all say, you know, what are you going to do with your kid this summer? I can't believe they're going to be home all summer. We might all strangle each other or whatever. I know you're all better parents than I am. You know, if we're not having those conversations, then everybody's isolated and resentful and trying to deal with it on their own. You know, and then doing the same at home. You know, we have to have that same reflective listening with our family members, you know, and not just have it be all about how hard my day at work was, but also what's going on with them, and giving them power, like Cindy was saying at the beginning, you know, to come up with their own solutions. We were all intelligent, competent human beings before this pandemic hit, and we all do have strategies. And even kids have strategies, you know, if we listen to them. Listening to them doesn't mean you need to approve. You can listen to somebody and just listen. You don't need to approve or disapprove, right? I mean, kids can come up with some pretty crazy stuff, but just feeling like we listen and we take them seriously. But at the end of the day, we're the parent and we make the decisions. And I think it's the same for managers, right? That we're so threatened by opening that Pandora's, you know, if we open this box of asking people what they need, you know, it's going to lead to further resentment. And it's actually the contrary. The more we're able to listen to people's wishes and desires, we can say, wow, those are great wishes and desires. In fact, I have them myself now that you bring them up, but I'm not able to put them in place right now. I don't have the resources. And then it's on the table. You know, we talk about transparency is actually soothing. We think we're protecting kids, or we think we're protecting staff by not telling the full truth. It's the opposite. We're actually adding to the stress when we don't share the whole truth, and we leave it to the imagination. That's where the conspiracy theories come up, right? I don't really understand what's going on, so I'm going to come up with a cockamamie explanation of what's going on. And actually, if we give people, if we have that space where people can ask questions, and we give them that space to give them the truth, even if the truth is ugly, even if the truth is, no, we don't have the equipment, you know, and it's not on its way. Or, sweetie, you know, school is not going to start again. You're not going to see your friends for a while. I understand it's awful. So really doing that for each other. I don't know if that's helpful, or that's just putting another burden on you.
I think that was great. We have one more question in here. How do you help staff members take a day off? They've been told they can. We have some that constantly sabotage that date with themselves.
That's a good one. Do you take your days off is my question, first of all.
To be a good example, a role model, like we were saying, yes. Yes, because I actually had this problem where I'd make everybody go home at the end of the shift, but somehow I stayed very late, and I realized everybody started feeling very anxious, like because the boss was there, they had to be there too. It created a lot of anxiety on the team, even though I thought, oh, I'm having everybody go home and take care of themselves. So modeling this kind of self-care was really important. And yeah, just scheduling those days off. They might be at that point where they've lost the insight to know that they're really overstressed. So we might need to help them with that.
Yeah, we have some projects where there's a mandatory weekend off every 6 weeks, whether you want it or you don't want it. We you know, put you somewhere so that you have to rest if you want it or not.
Yeah.
So sometimes, yeah, I mean, if you know what's best for people, but are you doing it for yourself if it is what's best for people?
Excellent. Well, I don't see any other questions or hand raises. So I think that means this is the end of our webinar. I do want to give Cindy and Athena one last opportunity to say anything else you want to share before we close.
Well, from my side, you know, this is going to touch us. This is going to touch our hearts. This is going to worry us. You know, this may even change us, but there are ways that we will survive this, and there are ways that we'll make it through together. And this is what I'm excited for.
Yeah, and that all research shows that the most important protective factor in mental well-being is social support, you know. So as long as we have each other, we have a good chance of making it through. And just
let me
thank you for your work. It's such an honor and privilege to be able, even though we can't see you, to be here with you. It really is.
And let me just say that we are offering our support during this time, and with infection control and with mental health support, where we can come on site and we can assist. So we would be honored to also help you in some practical ways too.
Awesome. Well, thank you both so much. Thank you, the whole team at Doctors Without Borders. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on our website. So if you have staff members that weren't able to participate and want to view this later, that link is will be available tomorrow sometime on our website on the COVID page under the members only section where all the other COVID webinars are. So feel free to tell your coworkers to jump on there and watch this webinar. Thank you again so much for joining us, and thank you to Dr. Cindy and Athena. We really appreciate you guys.
Thank you.
Have a great day.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.